a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, writers. I'm here to tell you some good news. Memoir Nation, the new writing endeavor that Brooke and I have been working on for a year now, is now live. And you know, so many people, I've heard this over the years, they say, I'm going to write my story someday. But someday tends to kind of always be off in the distance. And we're here to help you start writing your story today. We're providing the inspiration, the guidance, the structure, and support to equip you creatively, emotionally, and psychologically, and perhaps more to write your life story. And there are several packages of support and inspiration that you can sign up for, but I'm going to spotlight one for you now as a listener to our podcast. Out of the gate, the $99 level of membership is going to give you a lot of perks, including a weekly newsletter with lots of memoir insights and tips and advice and encouragement. And it will also get you the bonus podcast content and a code for a free future class of your choosing. So it's a really good deal for $99, but also important to us is that it's support we need to launch this thing, get it off the ground, make it sustainable. And if you've been a longtime listener and you like the content you get on this show, there's going to be a lot more growth and exciting things in the weeks and months and years to come. So we invite you to join us at this $99 subscriber level. Check out the other levels, though. They might be better for you. You know, we've done this podcast for more than 6 years now, and we've actually done it entirely for free and as a labor of love, and we do love it, but we'd also love your support as we expand the ways we help writers tell their stories. So we'll make it worth your while, we promise, and we thank you in advance for supporting us to create the space we're dreaming of for writers like you. Visit memoirnation.com.
Hello, explorers, void circlers, and excavators of deep truths and would-be lost stories. Welcome to Memoir Nation and a special episode with one of the leading voices in contemporary American poetry, Victoria Chang, who happens to have also written a memoir called Dear Memory, in addition to her collections of poetry. So, Grant, I am super excited to have Victoria Chang on the podcast today. And, you know, you and she have something very powerful in common, which is that her experience of losing her parents led to a reckoning of all she didn't know, of everything that she lost when her parents died and how everything really died with them. She lost stories, the things she didn't know or never asked or never could ask. I think this is a common thing that happens. And yet, of course, it very much reminds me of the raison d'etre of Memoir Nation, which is your story of wishing that your father had left you something of his life story. Mm-hmm. So I thought we could start there with silence, what goes unsaid in a life. And I'm curious to know, was your dad a naturally quiet or guarded person, or was it just, like a lot of kids, you didn't ask questions?
Yeah, it was actually all of the above. Like a lot of Iowans, and perhaps especially those like him who grew up on a poor farm in the Depression, and, he spent most of his childhood working. I think there was a standard of stoicism and taciturnity that was and is deeply embedded in the culture, especially for men. And his entire family actually was also just relatively inexpressive. So it went beyond the culture, I think. For example, I don't remember anyone really telling stories at holiday dinners. And I remember a lot of uncomfortable silences as a kid. And then, like most children, as you said, I think we can be overly self-involved when it comes to our parents. We're so used to being at the center of attention that it's difficult to shift gears and start asking more questions about them. And I always meant to go back and do a formal interview with both my parents, actually. But, I always had my kids. There was always something happening. And, in retrospect, I think I should have paid a professional to do it, that would have been money well spent. But that said, my father did like telling stories about parts of his life. And he did things like work the night shift in a psych ward to earn the money to go to college. And he served in the occupation of Japan after World War II, which was literally his first time leaving his home. So it's just crazy for me to think about him growing up on this farm in Iowa and going from basic training and then getting on a ship and sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge on the way to Japan. And I do know that he saw Billie Holiday in San Francisco before going there. So, I get this kind of certain exotic types of stories. And, I heard some stories. We had a tradition of sitting on our back porch and drinking gin and tonics when I came home in the summer. But that said, I know there were many more stories and emotions that were never expressed and perhaps not even unearthed to himself, because part of the wonderfulness of writing your story is how much you discover along the way. So, Brooke, we're kind of in the same place, though. Like, you lost your dad recently, too. And I wonder whether these ideas resonate with you and whether your dad left you with a legacy of stories or a legacy of silence.
Yeah, it's a great question. More silence for sure. I think it's a really interesting question for each of us to ponder, the listeners as well, right? As we all consider our families of origin. My dad had a history of estrangement in his family. I would say a legacy of estrangement. It's kind of an interesting story since we're telling family stories. His father, my grandfather, was orphaned when he was quite young, and he and his two brothers grew up in an orphanage. And what I know of this story is that the boys were Jewish and they grew up in a Jewish orphanage that was quite abusive and harsh, and they never got adopted. And so when the eldest brother aged out, he adopted his own two brothers, and then they were on their own, so 18 and younger out in the world. And my grandfather was the only one of the brothers who renounced his Judaism. And it created quite a rift between him and his brothers. And then, interestingly, as stories will go, my dad had two brothers. So this is, this legacy of estrangement. And when my dad came out as gay, his older brother, I guess, disapproved. I'm not totally sure to what extent, but then again, there's a rift between these brothers, and my dad was completely estranged from this brother. And so it's like there's just been a lot of separateness in this family. I know who the other families are, the kids of my great uncles. One of those families even lives in Berkeley, and I have barely spent time with them over the years. I just kind of know who they are. And so I experienced this as a loss once removed. It's really interesting because it's an intellectual loss for me rather than an emotional loss, because I don't really know these people, but I do experience this sense of so much has dropped off of the family tree and lineage and relationships I never had because my dad was so silent and never reckoned with his propensity to shut people out and or to extend himself. Right. And so I think it's interesting, when he passed away, there were all these stories. I never really asked him about how he felt about any of those things or why it really happened. And I think it's pretty common, the stories that I do know, I don't think directly came from my dad. I think that instead they came from my uncle, the younger brother, who he retained a relationship with. And Grant, it made me think about when we recently interviewed Liz Rosner, we were talking about listening. But of course, when you talk about listening, you have to talk about silence, and secrets and what you overhear. And I wanted to ask you more about, I guess, this relationship to silence, because it's such a powerful theme in Victoria Chang's writing. And she actually jolted me a bit because she writes about this notion that the more we write into silence, the more we probe silence and the closer we get to our shame. And I got to thinking that maybe that's why it's so hard for me or us to be in silence, that it's actually quite uncomfortable to be alone with your thoughts sometimes. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think a lot about silence, in part because I think I do resist it a lot. And I certainly find it difficult to sit in silence, especially with another, because I think I just like spaces to be filled, I like action and reaction, a word, a joke, a riff that creates another word, joke, or riff. And I don't think I'm avoiding something shameful per se. I never think of it as being about shame, but I just gravitate to noise, for lack of a better word, for stimulation and creativity. And I'll confess, though, that I also, go to noise, I think, to avoid myself sometimes, in the sense of avoiding boredom or even to avoid thoughts I don't want to deal with or thoughts that are painful. So I guess that can be similar to shame. I just don't think of them as being anywhere, shame isn't is the center of the thoughts. But I did recently have an epiphany that I'm a workaholic, as I'm now identified as. And for this reason, I don't like having an unoccupied mind, because an unoccupied mind is kind of an uncomfortable place for me. And working can be strangely soothing. It's weird to put that word soothing with working, but it's true, because when I'm working, I'm constantly engaged in figuring out a problem or creating something. And the irony for me is that I used to welcome an unoccupied mind, and I even kind of luxuriated in an unoccupied mind. And I don't like doing that anymore. So there's something there about being uncomfortable, being alone with my thoughts. And I think that actually takes practice, and I've practiced so much workaholism these days that I've kind of lost that practice for silence.
Gosh, I relate to that a lot. I think it's actually quite cultural, this whole idea that we work to avoid. And then great, the more you avoid and the more you work, the more rewarded you are for it. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I do want to turn back to this question of things that we find out after the death of a loved one, because that's another thing that Victoria probes in her work quite fascinatingly. If we're lucky, we get papers and photos and documents to sort through, which can, of course, be overwhelming, but also quite revealing. And I just got to thinking of all this stuff when I was reading Victoria's work, and I want to so recommend Dear Memory, which are letters that she writes to her parents after their death, a letter to silence. One letter that I found among my dad's things was a letter dated 1943, which was a couple years before my dad was even born, stating that my dad's elder brother, the one he eventually became estranged with, was legally allowed to assume the name Warner. And when I read this, I took it to mean that this older uncle was somehow adopted, and it really took me aback. And luckily, as I said, I have a relationship with my dad's younger brother, so I wrote and asked him about it. And he was able to explain to me that most likely those parents who died, the ones that left their boys orphaned, had assumed the name Warner, because that clearly was not their original last name, and then it was never formalized. And so as such, my grandfather had been working to legalize the name, and then that only happened in 1943. I just found that entire story fascinating, but it also gave me pause, because if my younger uncle, my dad's younger brother, hadn't been alive, I would have probably made the assumption that my other uncle was adopted, and that would have been wrong. And it makes me curious about what we get wrong when we don't know, and the ripple effects of silence, which leave us in the dark, not knowing, but maybe also filling in the blanks. So I guess I wanted to ask you about this. Do you have family stories like this where you feel like you had to fill in the blanks, or, something you might have discovered in the aftermath of your dad's passing that surprised you?
I think a lot of silences exist. And I actually experienced a type of family tragedy for me, because my mom, she recently moved into a care facility, and the person we hired to imagine the estate sale didn't honor our agreement to not touch anything before I got home to go through things. And it's a long story of like misunderstandings or miscommunication, but everything ended up being rushed, and he ended up throwing away a bunch of things that he considered trash, or maybe my siblings considered trash, but that I wanted to sift through. And I was specifically looking for a box of my parents' letters to each other when they were very young. And I'd actually found them in our basement as a kid, but I'd never been able to find them again. And I think they were thrown away by the estate manager or other things like that. So, there are a lot of silences. And since we make meaning of the world by making up stories, I think our brains just naturally fill those silent spaces with stories based on the little nuggets of evidence of anything that we have. And so my guess is that we're all living in various types of inaccuracies. And one thing I did discover were a bunch of Valentine's Day cards in a trash can of all places. And it was interesting because it was a private thing. They exchanged, my parents exchanged cards, and I'm assuming some sort of present every year. And I'd always thought of my mom as the more expressive one in the family, but in these cards, my father was much more effusive and romantic and thankful than her messages were. And it was touching seeing him kind of trying to give voice to his feelings in this way, because one of the things my brother, sister, and I have noticed is that he showed his love primarily through providing, not words. And in fact, his last words to us were making sure we knew what was in the safety deposit box at the bank, for the umpteenth time. And, the irony of the letters, though, that might have been thrown away is that the same thing happened to my grandfather's letters. And one of the silences that I would like to have figured out, and never will, is that he lived most of his life away from my mom and my grandmother. So he supposedly had to earn money teaching in a college in Tennessee, but he taught there for 35 years. And I always wondered why he couldn't have found a job closer to Iowa. And I don't know if he didn't look, or if maybe he liked being far away, because he and my grandmother never particularly got along, at least when I was around them. So I don't know. There's a mystery there that'll never be solved. Yeah, and I think the definition of family history is the many silences we live with.
Yeah, and maybe this is why some people tackle fiction, when it comes to solving family mysteries, because there's just not enough evidence there to tackle it on, not straight on anyway. So that's all very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great gifts of Victoria's body of work about grief and loss and silence and more is the way that it opens up questions. And so I do want to take a beat here to impress upon our listeners the way in which our conversation about losing our dads and about our family's own legacy of silence stems from what we extracted from Victoria's writing, and that is what good memoir does. Like the books are about Victoria and her own experience, but it's an invitation to something much more universal. It's about family dynamics, what we lose when we lose the people who hold our stories. And for that reason, I think it's also a reminder to take the time that we can with those who are still with us. If we have the relationships, the capacity, the openness to do so. So Grant, thank you for sharing those stories, and thanks for the opportunity to share mine as well. And I am excited about this conversation with Victoria Chang. We will be tuning in and turning to that in this moment right after this break. Welcome back, everyone. Today we have Victoria Chang with us. Victoria's most recent book of poems is With My Back to the World, published in 2024. It received the Forward Prize in Poetry for Best Collection. Some of her other books include The Trees Witness Everything, OBIT, and Dear Memory, Letters on Writing, Silence, and Grief. She has written several children's books as well, and she's received multiple fellowships and prizes and is the Bourne Chair in Poetry at Georgia Tech and Director of Poetry at Tech. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. And I want to start with this body of work that's come out in the last several years. You published 4 books since 2020, starting with OBIT in 2020, then Dear Memory in 2021, The Trees Witness Everything in 2022, and With My Back to the World in 2024. And I wondered if you could talk about the work and its interconnectivity. I saw an interview in which you described OBIT as an offshoot of Dear Memory, or someone had characterized it that way. And I'd love to hear more about that, especially because OBIT was first. And so how you think about your work in that way, like if you're collecting things, uncovering things, and, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Actually, someone, I can't remember who it was, once described OBIT, The Trees Witness Everything, and also Dear Memory as a kind of a trilogy.
Mm.
And I've been thinking about that because they're all sort of dealing with similar themes of grief, and all were written sort of in a shorter period of time, and they all came out in a short period of time. And I think that's true. I think they're all related in some ways, because I think books are also, these arbitrary human-made objects. And I mean, your grief doesn't just stay in that book, if that makes sense. It doesn't just decide to stop when you finish writing OBIT. And so I think, I think that's sort of how I think about it too now, once someone sort of mentioned that.
Well, and if I could ask you to follow up on this question of like how the work comes to you, because like OBIT is done, and then is it the next book just starts to write itself and then it becomes the next thing? I'm just really curious about, like I was saying, is it that you're collecting new ideas, or you have more to say on the topic?
I think with, OBIT was really hard to write. And obviously the reception was really extraordinary to me. I didn't realize so many people would read it or connect with it. And the next book, I think, was Dear Memory. And, that just came out of an experience of finding a storage facility where my mother had, collected a lot of things. And so once I found that storage facility, I found all these papers and boxes of stuff. And I suddenly knew like all this information about my parents and then their relatives, people I never knew, like my grandparents' names and stuff like that. And so I was excited initially, but then, I had more questions. Like sometimes not having information is actually better. When you have too much, then you have more questions. But I didn't have anyone to ask those questions to. And that's how I started writing the epistolary lyric kind of essays in Dear Memory, I started writing a letter to my mother. So the first one was Dear Mother, and I just kept on going. And then the Trees Witness Everything, I think I was just, looking to write some poems, but not have any ideas sort of ahead of time. So I just gave myself some fun things to play around with, like syllabic forms. And then also, those poems use W.S. Merwin's poem titles as their own. And so I just think I was in a very rich writing and creative period during that time. And I actually knew that I was in a rich creative period. And so I heard some people tell you and ask you all sorts of interesting questions. They use the word prolific a lot. And I just sort of ignored them all because I knew I was in a rich writing period and I was going to take advantage of that, if that makes sense. Like writing seizes you. And so what a gift to be seized. And I'm not in that period anymore. And I knew it would end. And so I was really happy to be in that period. And that's sort of when all those books were made.
Such an interesting way to think about the periods of our writing life. And we recently rebranded our podcast to be Memoir Nation, to focus on memoir. But of course, memoir these days is really morphing, and it encompasses a lot of things, including poetry and experimental memoir. And Dear Memory is categorized as a memoir. It's interesting to hear you refer to it more as like lyric essays, which I think is an interesting way in. And it's certainly experimental in that it takes the epistolary form, as you mentioned, and to your parents who aren't alive anymore, and to past teachers, and to your grandfather, and to old classmates, and even to silence. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the genre of memoir? And were you setting out to write memoir with Dear Memory, or just setting out to explore it, and it took on a form that turned out not to be poetry? Or, I even wondered for a while if you would call it prose poetry.
Yeah. I mean, I think I love things that are uncategorizable or are multi-categorizable. Those kinds of things excite me because, I don't really think of myself as just a poet, but people call me a poet all the time. I think of myself as an artist or someone who makes things. And so I tend to kind of work across different, human-made genres. And so when I was starting to write those letters, I didn't really think about what they were. I knew they weren't poetry because they weren't quite concise enough, but I definitely knew that I was writing some kind of poetic prose. In terms of the memoir aspect, I think sometimes the word memoir can be considered like a dirty word kind of thing, especially amongst poets for some reason. But I knew I was writing autobiographical stories and asking those autobiographical questions. So I think you could probably classify most of my writing across poetry and Dear Memory, and even a lot of the children's books I write as memoir, if that makes sense. They're all stemming from my own experiences and my own perceptions of the world. They're just not sort of categorized that way. But absolutely, I think a lot of poets are writing memoir in their poems. I mean, their poems like that are all about their own life experiences and their perceptions.
Yeah, we completely agree. I think you could probably even apply that to fiction if you wanted to. I wanted to specifically ask you about your letter to silence and Dear Memory. It comes early in the book. You write this beautiful line that says, "I think I am circling around you, silence, your center. And the closer I get, the closer I am to shame, to the language of shame." This moved me, and I think it's moved a lot of people to think about the notion that silence is the language of shame. And I'm curious to know if you understood that to be the case before writing this letter, and, what did you understand or learn differently about silence and shame after you wrote that letter?
Yeah, I think, I think that whole book, and actually my writing process, is very much so, for better or for worse, a process of discovery, even though it may not appear to be that way. People sometimes laudingly or disparagingly, kind of label some of my books project books, depending on what perspective or assumption they come at it with. But I think people might be surprised or not to think about my work as being, I'm learning along the way. And I think a lot of writers do that. I mean, you might come to, your paper or your laptop or whatever. For me, it's paper usually, unless it's prose, it's sometimes laptop. But, I think that I come to my writing, through kind of like this desire to investigate questions, nagging questions that I have. And so, in the to your question about silence, I mean, I didn't really know that's what I was doing until I probably wrote that letter. And then I was exploring that idea. And then it becomes a bigger and bigger idea throughout the book. So by the end, it literally becomes the theme in some ways, or one of the many themes of the book. And I didn't know that when I first started. I had no idea, especially with that book. I had no idea what I was doing. So I think of that book as being sort of like an X-ray. You could see a moving X-ray. You could see how things, are moving through the body. Like if you eat something, it's like you can actually see the object move its way through the body, because it's for me such a, an example of process as a book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Victoria, you shared openly about experiencing shame and embarrassment while writing. And I feel like people will look at someone with your level of success and maybe not imagine that's true or believe you've gotten past it somehow. So I'm curious to know how you do push through when you feel that way when you're writing, and how do you come to terms with those feelings?
Yeah, I mean, shame is just sort of like a big part of my life. It's always been a part of my family culture, part of me. And, I think people can always tell, like some people who know these kinds of things are like, oh, you must have been totally bullied when you're growing up or something like that. Or they just kind of guess. And I was like, how did you know? And, I think, or you may have grown up with like a slightly more authoritarian parent. So people oftentimes, if they have those experiences or are familiar with those experiences, I think they kind of pinpoint those aspects of me. And I've sort of, it's odd because I feel shame all the time, but I've learned to kind of almost separate it from myself like an object. Like if I'm holding an apple, it's like the apple, it's not in me anymore. And so it's like, I experience that shame all the time, but in some ways I don't feel embarrassed about that shame. So I'm not shameful of that shame anymore, even though it's just a part of who I am. It's almost like built into my cells at this point. And so I actually think it's really important for writers to feel that sense of urgency when you're writing. Like the thing that you're writing about is so hard to actually get near that you might feel like if you get too close, like your eyebrows are going to get seared off. Like I think it's important to feel that sense of urgency, whether it's stemming from shame or fear, embarrassment, pain, trauma, joy, happiness, like I have no idea, but I think to me, I can tell like when something's written and it's, even if it's really this steely kind of like clean writing style, I can feel it. Like I can feel that this was somehow important to the writer that was writing whatever they're writing. And if I don't even have that, it's pretty hard for me to kind of get, integrated into whatever it is I'm reading myself, because I don't feel like the writer cared that much about it.
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience. I know exactly what you're talking about, and touching into it is both important and hard at the same time. Mm-hmm. Dear Memory, well, this kind of builds upon my last question, actually, because Dear Memory explores what you don't know. You just talked about that, like writing to explore the questions, writing into the unknown. But I was thinking about students I've had over the years who will tell me that they feel like they're casting around aimlessly, like they don't know what they're doing. They don't know where they're going. And you capture that with this quote from Donald Barthelme that said, "The writer is that person who, embarking upon her task, does not know what to do." So I'm curious, I mean, that's different than what you said, that you're sort of writing into the questions, but do you sometimes feel like you don't know what you're doing or casting around trying to find your way?
All the time. I mean, that's the fun of writing. If you knew what you were going to say and or how you're going to say it, then what's the point? That's not exciting. And so for me, I'm always trying new things so I can really push myself and experiment with subject matter or genre or styles or form. I'm constantly interested in challenging myself because to me, the whole writing process is the most important thing. Like the book does not matter to me. It's just sort of manifests itself into a book. But I just really love the process of discovery, creativity, and writing. And you really cannot know ahead of time. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very enjoyable.
Victoria, in closing, you're known for writing about unspoken stories and cultural disconnection. And some of this stems from the immigrant experience, since many immigrants, hold their traumas close and historically have not, disclosed family secrets, perhaps to protect their children or to forget. And I wonder what you found in your exploration of silence to maybe be the positives that reside there, if there are positives. Seems to me that there's the hard part, which is feeling closer to shame the more you poke around in there, but that there must be a counter to this as well, beautiful aspects or gifts of silence that have made you the writer and person you are.
Oh, there's so many gifts. I think that I think about so many things all the time about like a different kind of childhood, and I think about my own kids and what a different kind of childhood that they have. And I really envy them sometimes. A lot, actually. But then I think to myself, if I didn't have the kind of childhood that I had, where we didn't talk about anything, I didn't know anything. They're like, like what topic wasn't taboo kind of thing. I really feel like I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And I 100% would not maybe be a writer. Maybe I'd be doing something else, but it's almost like I wouldn't have any questions. I would just be a regular old, I call the rest of the world people who don't have these sort of desires to make things and artistically or have questions. I call them pedestrians. And it's not because they're pedestrian or common. It's because they are literally pedestrians. They walk around the world in sort of this happy way that I admire and I envy, but that wasn't my fate. And I think that what a gift, it was to me, because through my writing, I met so many people that are just like me. And in some ways, I feel that sense of community. And I think that's important too. Like, you can't have all the people walking around happy all the time. Like you need other people who, are querying and confused and want to sort of create art that sort of tries to sort of get at the meaning of their experiences.
Thank you, Victoria. We're so grateful for your insights and that you came on today. So we so appreciate it.
Thank you. It's nice talking to you.
We'll be right back with this week's Substacking.
Well, Grant, earlier this spring, you wrote a Substack post called Silence as a Way to Hear Yourself. And in that piece, you wrote, "The irony of emptiness, of silence, it teems with surprising activity." And you also wrote, "Silence is a cleansing of one's thoughts, an invitation for your inner life to walk about and perhaps even dance." I love this meditation on silence, and I think it came in the wake of our interview with Liz Rosner, because we talked about silence on that episode too, and our relationship with it and to it, which is a bit different than the angle we took today with Victoria Chang. Like that was more about being in silence, and this is more about the legacy of silence and its impact. I wonder what your thoughts are about the opposite of a legacy of silence. Like what's it going to be like for our kids to literally have hundreds of hours of podcast episodes and mountains of pages of writing? Do you think that since they have everything contrasted to your having gotten nothing from your dad, that they're just not going to have, the longing that you do to know?
Brooke, we are giving our kids such an enormous gift of ourselves.
Clearly.
They will get to listen to us for years, we'll be inexhaustible. No, it's a really interesting question, and I think about it a lot. And, as a writer, I get asked to write things that I might not necessarily write about. And for example, I just wrote an essay on cooking crawfish étouffée for an anthology of stories that, revolved around recipes and experiences of recipes and food. And I would have never written that essay or told that story of my first étouffée if I hadn't been a writer and asked to do this. And as I wrote it, I wondered if my kids would read it someday. And I also thought about what you just said. I have left them words and words and words and all sorts of digital things on the internet. So if they have the longing, they'll have plenty of sources to go to. But I'm not sure that they'll have the longing, or how expansive that'll be. I often think of that irony that maybe they're content with their experience of me and they don't need to do a PhD in Grant Faulkner studies through all of my writing, Mm-hmm. So how about you and James?
Yeah, I mean, right now he's 14 and he is ever the 14-year-old, it's like I think about myself at that age and I don't even think that I thought of my parents as having a life beyond what I needed from them. Mm-hmm. And I do kind of feel like I exist in this very specific and singular role as mom, which is good, honestly, very normal. But I do wonder what it would be like when he's older, if my stuff will be a source of pride or embarrassment or both. And it's curious to think about how perhaps, like people who touch up against silence or whose homes of origin are very silent are the ones who feel compelled to break silence, right? To push towards the opposite of it. While of course, people who live in very open households, where everything is out and where they know everything might be pushed to, the exact opposite, mm-hmm. either to not care or just not to feel like there's that hole that they're constantly trying to fill. So that's something that occurs to me for sure. Most of the memoirists that I work with, of course, come from places of trauma or things that they're trying to solve. And in the absence of that, I guess I would say like maybe that's just not going to be there. And I'd love that for him, honestly.
Yeah. Life is so much about the stories we know to be true and the stories we make up. So I always think of our life stories as holding a lot of fiction, and as a fiction writer, I've grown very comfortable with this because I think what matters most is the essence of truth, not so much its specifics. But, my father was much more non-fictional, as many people are. And I think that was partly because he was a lawyer. So I guess he was trained in what can be proven or demonstrated in court, and the essence of the truth didn't really have a place in that, And I remember he'd get frustrated by movies that showed the past differently than he remembered it. And I think it's interesting that we all need something different from the past. A friend of mine who was 84, she wrote her memoir last year and it was published, and her children actually told her they had no interest in reading it. So, we don't know how or if our story will even be received. And with that, I feel like I'm ending the show on some heavy, hard stuff, but I think the light is in the telling of the stories the best we can. It's in the connection with another person, which can happen for us just in writing the stories. We can feel a connection even if it's imagined. And I hope that's what we give each week here on Memoir Nation, that attempt at connection through our words. So I want to thank the listeners for tuning in and sharing this pursuit with us. And thanks to our listeners also for sticking with us as we turn more energetically toward memoir through Memoir Nation. And if you haven't signed up already, please go to memoirnation.com and sign up, at least for our free monthly newsletter, our free package. And we'll see you next week.